Few clashes in medieval history ignite the imagination as powerfully as the Battle of Agincourt. On a rain-soaked French plain, October 25, 1415, a young English king, Henry V, faced the ordeal with a starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered army against the proud flower of French chivalry. What unfolded was far more than a triumph. It became a decisive turning point in the 100 Years' War, where the English longbow humbled armoured nobles and sheer resolve bent the course of destiny. This is the tale of how weary peasants and disciplined archers, under the command of a relentless king, shattered a force that by all measure should have swept them aside. The Battle of Agincourt did not burst forth without cause. It was the culmination of a campaign fueled by dynastic ambition, bitter national rivalry, and deep-rooted claims to kingship. By 1415, the 100 Years' War had already dragged on for decades, marked by shifting fortunes, uneasy truces, and resurgent bloodshed. Its origins reached back to 1337, when Edward III of England staked his bold claim to the French crown. That dynastic contest had spiraled into a grinding struggle of raids, sieges, and decisive encounters such as Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, where English longbowmen had already shown their devastating power. Yet, by the late 14th century, England itself was weakened by turmoil at home and crushing financial burdens, while France lay paralyzed in civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Into this fractured stage stepped Henry V, crowned King of England in 1413. Henry was no ordinary sovereign. Resolute, devout, and sharpened by military skill, he sought legitimacy within England and renown beyond its shores. He revived the ancient English claim to the French crown, demanding recognition of his sovereignty and territories. When France refused, Henry unleashed his campaign. In August 1415, he crossed the Channel with nearly 12,000 men, a force of knights, men-at-arms, and most crucially, thousands of longbowmen, the weapon that would carve his triumph. The English landed in Normandy and soon laid siege to the port of Harfleur. The assault was punishing and costly. Dysentery swept through the camp, felling hundreds and leaving thousands weakened. By late September, when Harfleur finally yielded, Henry's host was already diminished. Yet, despite heavy losses, the king chose a daring gamble: march his army across hostile France to the English bastion of Calais. The journey was fraught with peril. French forces shadowed their advance, gathering strength to strike. The English, wasted by disease and starved of supplies, dragged themselves through rivers and mire, their plight growing ever more desperate. By mid-October, the French had gathered a colossal host, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 strong, arrayed against Henry's exhausted force of barely 6,000. The snare was tightening, and so at dawn on October 25, 1415, the two armies stood poised near a modest village in northern France, Agincourt. The road to that field had already drained England to the bone. After weeks of relentless marches, the scourge of dysentery, gnawing hunger, and the constant shadow of defeat, Henry V's men now confronted an enemy that eclipsed them in sheer numbers and dazzling display. The moment had arrived for a battle that would either etch Henry's name in immortality or shatter his crown upon the mud of France. The ground at Agincourt appeared deceptively ordinary, a narrow stretch of farmland hemmed in by dense woods on either flank. On the eve of battle, heavy rain had drenched the earth, turning the fields into a mire of mud and treachery. This seemingly minor detail would prove disastrous for the heavily armoured French knights and men-at-arms. The constricted terrain also denied them the chance to fully wield their overwhelming numbers. Rather than sweeping around Henry's outmatched host, they were forced into a narrow, funnel-like passage, a killing field perfectly suited to the English longbow. Henry V commanded perhaps 6,000 men, though accounts differ. The vast majority, nearly 5,000, were longbowmen drawn from sturdy English yeomen hardened by years of relentless training. Their weapon, the English longbow, could unleash a relentless storm of arrows at ranges reaching 250 yards, able to pierce even the most elaborate armor of the age. The rest of Henry's force was made up of men-at-arms, knights, and weary infantry who would brace the line against the French onslaught. They were drained, malnourished, and weakened by disease, yet tempered by the harshness of survival. Henry himself was far more than a distant sovereign. Encased in full plate, sword in hand and shield raised, he fought among his soldiers, embodying the image of a king as warrior, the ruler who bore both peril and honor at their side. His presence and resolve may well have been his deadliest weapon. Opposing him stood a French host of 20,000 to 30,000 men, nearly 5 times the strength of Henry's battered ranks. The French forces were a sight to behold, a dazzling display of medieval might. Armored knights, proud lords, and soldiers from every corner of the realm stood ready, their banners snapping in the wind and their polished steel gleaming. Their belief in victory was absolute. Yet beneath this impressive facade lay critical weaknesses. The French command was fractured, with ambitious nobles vying for individual glory. Confidence had morphed into arrogance. Many knights were so certain of English defeat that they openly bickered over who would claim King Henry for ransom. While crossbowmen and infantry swelled their ranks, the noble knights were determined to lead the charge, driven by a desire for personal honor. That overconfidence would soon prove ruinous. On the night of October 24, 1415, the two armies glared at one another across the sodden fields. The French encampment was alive with laughter, music, and the arrogance of a victory they believed already won. Some nobles even cast dice to decide which English captives they would claim. In the English camp, the mood could not have been more different. Henry commanded his men to ready themselves for a desperate stand. Food was meager, spirits were strained, and exhaustion pressed heavily upon them all. Yet the king moved among his soldiers, speaking words of resolve, reminding them of their duty and the righteousness of their cause. Chroniclers record that here Henry delivered lines that would echo through the centuries, immortalized later in Shakespeare's Henry V, a vow that those who bled at Agincourt would be remembered for all time. The English longbowmen sharpened their stakes and drove them firmly into the earth, forming a jagged wall of defense. The mire clung to their boots and the cold gnawed at their bones. Yet they remained steadfast. Dawn broke on October 25, 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, patrons of cobblers and craftsmen. For Henry, the symbolism was striking. On a day honoring humble men, an army of archers and common soldiers would stand against the grandeur of French nobility. As the pale sun rose over the fields of Agincourt, both hosts prepared for battle. French knights mounted their heavy chargers, armor rattling in the morning chill. Across the line, English archers tightened their bowstrings, silent and resolute. The destiny of kingdoms would be settled not by sheer numbers, but by ground, resolve, and the merciless storm of arrows soon to fall. The sun had scarcely risen above the horizon when the silence finally shattered. Across the sodden field, French banners unfurled proudly, bearing the arms of the Valois dynasty and the emblems of mighty noble houses. The knights of France, their armor gleaming like mirrors, waited restlessly, their destriers stamping and snorting in the cold morning air. On the English line there was only stillness. The soldiers knew that to move too soon would mean certain death. King Henry commanded his host to hold fast behind the line of sharpened stakes driven into the earth, cruel barriers designed to break the fury of a cavalry charge. The longbowmen stood shoulder to shoulder, bows strung tight, arrowheads glinting with lethal promise. The battlefield itself was a narrow corridor, hemmed in by thick woodland pressing close on either side. Trapped in a narrowing funnel, the French knights found their vast numbers rendered ineffective. The ground between the two armies, a mire of heavy, sucking mud from relentless rain, made every advance an ordeal. Despite being hopelessly outnumbered, Henry V understood that inaction was not an option. With supplies dwindling and his soldiers exhausted from weeks of grueling marches, the English faced starvation if the French chose to wait them out. With calculated resolve, Henry ordered his men to advance a short distance and drive their stakes closer to the French lines. This audacious maneuver stunned the enemy. A smaller, battered force was openly challenging them. French pride could not tolerate such an insult. Determined to swiftly crush the English, the French vanguard began to move. As the first ranks of armored knights struggled through the mire, the sky was obscured by the whistling flight of thousands of English arrows. The English longbowmen unleashed volley after volley, the snap of bowstrings echoing like 1,000 drum beats. Arrows fell in a relentless storm, piercing mail and plate, striking horses and sowing havoc among the advancing lines. Mounts shrieked and collapsed, hurling armored riders into the mire, while the once solid formation splintered under the assault. Unlike the French crossbow, which demanded precious time to reload, the English longbow could deliver a ceaseless rain, 10 to 12 arrows each minute from a single archer. With nearly 5,000 bowmen in Henry's ranks, the sky became a tempest of iron that transformed the battlefield into a charnel ground. Enraged and desperate to silence the deadly archers, the French knights spurred their cavalry into a furious charge aimed at the English flanks. The horses thundered into motion, but the ground betrayed them. Hooves plunged into the sucking mire, momentum faltered, and when they reached the line of sharpened stakes, the charge collapsed in bloody ruin. Arrows tore into men and beasts alike. Mounts impaled themselves upon the defences, hurling riders into the mud, where English archers rushed forward with mallets and daggers to finish the fallen. What should have been a crushing blow dissolved into chaos and slaughter. Meanwhile, the French men-at-arms advanced on foot. Encased in heavy plate, they slogged through the quagmire, burdened by their own splendor. Each laboring step sank them deeper, reducing their progress to a crawl. Yet sheer weight of numbers allowed them to close the gap. Wave after wave of knights pressed forward under the storm of arrows, their armor bristling with shafts like hedgehog spines. Many collapsed, but still more surged on, intent on breaking the outnumbered English line by brute force alone. The battlefield descended into a vision of mud, blood, and steel. French knights were crammed so tightly within the narrow ground that the fallen were crushed beneath their comrades, suffocating in the muck beneath the weight of armor. The longbowmen's storm of arrows never relented, cutting down swathes of men before they even touched the English line. At last, the leading waves of French warriors collided with the English men-at-arms. A brutal melee erupted, swords rang, axes hewed, and armored men grappled in the mire, steel scraping against steel. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, striking with lethal precision, urging his soldiers onward with both blade and voice. The English front bent beneath the pressure but refused to yield. Behind them, the longbowmen still loosed arrows into the crush, striking the rear ranks and preventing the French from bringing their full might forward. The struggle had truly begun, a trial of endurance, valor, and the unforgiving power of terrain and strategy. The field of Agincourt transformed into a deadly trap. What began as a vibrant display of French chivalry, with gleaming armor and high-flying banners devolved into a nightmarish tangle of steel and mud. The narrow terrain, once promising glory, became a curse as sheer numbers worked against them. Wave after wave of French men-at-arms surged forward, each rank pressing the one ahead, desperate to engage the English. However, the battlefield itself betrayed them. Horses stumbled and fell, their riders trampled in the ensuing panic. Knights, encumbered by their plate armor, sank into the mud and could not rise, many suffocating, crushed by their comrades who blindly pushed onward. The English line strained under the immense pressure, men-at-arms locked shields, bracing against the relentless tide of French steel. Sword clashed against sword, mace struck helmet, and bodies heaved together in a furious, noisy maelstrom. Henry's army, outnumbered, exhausted, and hemmed in, fought for survival. Still they held their ground. As the French drew nearer, the longbowmen changed their approach. Many discarded their bows for axes, hammers, and knives. They charged from the flanks, falling upon the mired French, thrusting into visor slits, prying at armor joints, or pulling knights to the ground to be killed in the mud. Though the archers were lightly armored compared to the knights, their mobility was an asset in the dense fighting. They moved among the fallen like wolves among deer, cutting down the helpless and preventing the French advance from regaining momentum. Amidst the core of the battle, King Henry V himself fought with fierce resolve. His mud-streaked helmet, adorned with a welded crown, gleamed amidst the chaos. A French knight, the Duke of Alençon, struck a mighty blow that dented the king's crown. Yet Henry rallied his bodyguards, cutting down his attacker and holding the line. The sight of their bloodied but unbroken king fighting alongside them ignited the English troops. The cry of "St. George, St. George" echoed across the battlefield, rising above the din. The French commanders had underestimated the mud, the bottleneck, and the relentless arrows. Their glorious cavalry charges had failed. Their men-at-arms were suffocating under their own numbers, and the English line, instead of breaking, grew stronger with each repelled wave. Soon the French vanguard was so tightly packed that they could not even swing their swords. Immobilized and exhausted, they became effortless prey for English blades. The slaughter intensified, becoming merciless. Behind them, the second and third waves of French knights struggled forward, but the battlefield had transformed into a graveyard of men and horses. Each new rank stumbled over the fallen, sinking deeper into the mire, their formations breaking before they could even reach the enemy. By midday, Agincourt was a vision of hell. Thousands of armored corpses littered the mud. The cries of the dying blended with the whistling of arrows and the clash of steel. Blood ran in rivulets through the mire, mixing with the rain and filth, until the field itself appeared to bleed. Yet the French nobility continued to push forward, driven by pride, honor, and desperation. And still, the English stood fast, grimly cutting down all who faced them. The battle's decisive moment was imminent. The vast French army, once so proud, was disintegrating. Its formidable knights, hampered by the unforgiving terrain and exhaustion, crumbled under the fierce attack of Henry's smaller yet disciplined forces. By afternoon, the glittering banners and all the strength of France's nobility had dissolved into utter chaos. The vanguard lay shattered, their horses strewn across the muddy field like fallen towers. The second division, intended to overwhelm the weary English, instead stumbled over corpses, sank knee-deep in mud, and collided with their own comrades. The cries of Montjoie Saint-Denis faded, drowned out by the grim chant of Saint George from the English soldiers. The French advance stalled, and with it, their hope of victory. The very battlefield conspired against them. The narrowing land funneled their ranks, packing them so tightly that breathing, let alone fighting, became almost impossible. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, pinning men beneath them. Knights who fell could not rise again, smothered by the crushing press of bodies. Henry's army, though equally exhausted, held a grim advantage. Despite the challenging conditions, their position on higher ground, protected by the surrounding woods, gave them a significant advantage. The relentless longbowmen capitalized on the mud and rain, which had once seemed a hindrance, but now proved to be their greatest asset. However, a sudden alarm swept through the English forces when reports reached Henry of a French cavalry attack on their baggage train behind the lines. A new fear emerged. The French prisoners, high-ranking nobles held for ransom, might arm themselves and join the assault. Faced with the immediate threat of betrayal from within and disaster from behind, Henry made an unprecedented and brutal decision in medieval warfare. He ordered the immediate execution of all prisoners. Hundreds of France's wealthiest and most prestigious knights were cut down in cold blood, their pleas for ransom ignored. Despite resistance from some English captains, the slaughter was swift. Survival, not chivalry, dictated the court. The 3rd French Division, their final hope, advanced hesitantly, having witnessed the carnage. Comrades piled high, nobles dead or captured, banners torn and muddied. The mud clung to their boots, arrows rained down, and morale plummeted. Reaching the English lines, they found not a broken army, but a force emboldened by survival. English archers, many armed with swords, axes, and maces, charged into the bogged-down knights. The French assault quickly turned into a massacre, not a battle. The proud French army, tens of thousands strong, was decimated by a force a third its size. English soldiers, muddy and bloodied, raised their weapons in triumph as the last resistance crumbled, the battered banners of St. George fluttering in the damp autumn air. Against all odds, King Henry V had achieved one of the most stunning victories in medieval history. For the French, Agincourt was a catastrophe. Thousands of their nobility were dead or captured, including the Constable Charles d'Albret, the Dukes of Alençon, Bar, and Brabant, and countless others. The cream of French chivalry was wiped out in a single day. For Henry, the victory was more than military, it was divine vindication. Against overwhelming odds, with an army weary and starving, he had triumphed through discipline, strategy, and the unyielding power of the longbow. October 25, 1415 marked a pivotal moment on the muddy fields of Agincourt. As the sun set, the landscape transformed from farmland into a desolate scene of corpses, trampled earth, and broken weaponry permeated by the stench of blood and death. This battle shattered the illusion of the knights' invincibility and signaled the decline of armored cavalry, ushering in an era dominated by infantry and archers in European warfare. English soldiers carefully navigated the fallen, seeking survivors and salvaging armor and weapons. The battlefield was a scene of grim bounty for the common English archers and men-at-arms, littered with the scattered wealth of the French nobility, gold-encrusted hilts, fine plate armor, and mud-caked heraldic crates. This was a harvest that meant survival. The sheer scale of the French losses was staggering, shaking the very foundations of their pride and power. Estimates suggest between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers and nobles perished, a stark contrast to the mere few hundred English casualties. The roll call of the dead included prominent figures of French nobility, Charles d'Al, Constable of France, who fell while leading the vanguard, John I, Duke of Alençon, who nearly struck Henry himself before being killed, Edward, Duke of Bar, and Philip, Duke of Brabant, both lost in the melee. Even more devastating than the fatalities, many other nobles, such as the Duke of Orléans and the Count of Eu, were captured and endured years of English captivity. The Battle of Agincourt was a turning point for both England and France. For England, it was a victory that transformed King Henry V from a ridiculed leader into a mythical figure, a warrior king chosen by God. His legendary Band of Brothers speech, immortalized by Shakespeare, became a symbol of English unity and defiance, solidifying Henry's image as a charismatic leader. For France, the defeat was not just a military loss, but a psychological blow. The loss of key political and military leaders crippled the kingdom's ability to resist, shattering the chivalric ideal that had sustained French nobility for centuries. Once considered invincible, the armored and mounted knight had met his match on a muddy field, undone by common men wielding bows and crude melee weapons. This defeat plunged French politics into chaos, exacerbating existing divisions from the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. The Battle of Agincourt, far from ending the 100 Years' War, only deepened these fractures. With so many nobles dead or captured, rival factions vied for influence, further crippling France's capacity to resist future English campaigns. The Battle of Agincourt marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power, granting England newfound prestige and leverage. Henry V's previously scoffed-at claim to the French throne became terrifyingly plausible. France, suffering a catastrophic blow to its leadership and morale, was left vulnerable. This vulnerability was further cemented less than a decade later by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne, a direct result of his burgeoning reputation and the devastation at Agincourt. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Agincourt was the triumph of the longbow. Once scorned as a peasant's weapon, the longbow profoundly impacted the greatest European knights. English archers had demonstrated their effectiveness earlier in the 100 Years' War at Crécy and Poitiers, but their decisive role at Agincourt was undeniable. The combination of muddy terrain, funneling landscape, and the archer's discipline forged a weapon of mass destruction that irrevocably altered medieval warfare. For centuries, plate-armored knights had been the undisputed masters of battle, but their invincibility was shattered. The era of the mounted aristocrat was fading, replaced by the looming age of infantry and firearms. In England, Agincourt became a cornerstone of national pride. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on St. Crispin's Day, became an enduring symbol of courage against overwhelming odds. Shakespeare's dramatic retelling cemented Henry IV's victory in English memory, transforming it from mere history into legend. In France, however, the battle was recalled with bitterness, a stark representation of arrogance, disunity, and tragedy, serving for centuries as a grim reminder of the high cost of noble pride and political division. More than just a clash of armies, Agincourt was a pivotal moment in the evolution of warfare and a political upheaval in Europe. It stands as a testament to human resilience and leadership amidst desperate circumstances. For Henry, it represented the zenith of glory. For France, a day of profound humiliation. Historically, it was a battle that singularly defined an era. The muddy fields of Agincourt, forever marked by hoofprints and blood, remain etched in Europe's collective consciousness, illustrating the precarious balance between triumph and disaster and the potent force of determination against seemingly insurmountable challenges. The enduring lessons of Agincourt define its legacy. Unity, not mere numerical superiority, proved decisive, demonstrating that a disciplined force with strong leadership can overcome immense odds. Technological advancements like the longbow fundamentally alter warfare, much as firearms would later. Hubris, as exemplified by French overconfidence, inevitably leads to disaster. Crucially, Henry V's leadership transformed desperation into victory, highlighting its decisive role. Centuries on, Agincourt remains a profoundly studied battle, standing alongside Thermopylae, Hastings, Waterloo, and Stalingrad as a pivotal moment that shaped the destinies of nations. For England, it became a symbol of glorious achievement. For France, a painful wound that ultimately fostered greater strength. For the world, it serves as a powerful reminder that the course of history is not solely dictated by the size of armies, but by the strategic choices of leaders, the unwavering courage of soldiers, and the unpredictable hand of fate. The quiet farmlands of Agincourt, once a muddy battlefield, still echo with the story of arrows raining down, knights succumbing to the mud, and a king whose destiny was forged not by numbers, but by his unyielding resolve. The legacy of Agincourt extends beyond just warfare. It embodies resilience, exceptional leadership, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity.